Welcome, workers and friends. Welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm one of your hosts, Dust James, the Marxist-Leninist truck driver. I'm coming to you live from my humble home in rural North Carolina. Let's see. I'm glad to be back on here with my great co-host, the Thunder from Down Under, labor organizer, union organizer, David Fox. How you doing?
Very good today. Very good today. I'm actually in the Ballarat Trades Hall, and actually in our office here at the moment.
Right on, right. Putting work in as we do, as we talk about the work, he's doing the work. So, round of applause for you, brother. So we got a good show tonight. We're very honored to have two great guests. Um, One of our first guests, which we haven't had on before, a new guest, Lily Goldklink of the Center for Political Innovation. She's a college student coming to us live from near Boston, I believe. This is your first time on. How you doing?
Great. Glad to be on here with you guys. I've been following your stuff for a while, and we met at the retreat in Pennsylvania, you and me, Dust, and just glad to be here to talk with you guys.
Right on. So we also have returning guests. It's always a pleasure when she comes on, a veteran in the labor movement, also a fellow driver, Helen Woolley. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Dust. Thanks very much for having me back on.
And so, Lily, this is your first time on the show. So, is there any way you could introduce yourself to the viewers? It's mainly a political show, but if you want to go into a little bit of your background on how you came into politics, what you've been doing, some of your positions, you go ahead.
Sure. So I'm a college student. I got into politics actually through the Bernie movement in 2016. As unlikely as it may sound, I was 12 years old, but I'm from down in Georgia, not the one Stalin was born in, but so I was kind of involved with the progressive movement from a young age. Parents weren't particularly political. Family wasn't really, just kind of got into it on my own. It just kind of made sense to me. And, since about 2019 or 2020, I've kind of become firmly like a anti-imperialist, socialist, communist, and found Caleb and Center for Political Innovation and you guys, and been working with Center for Political Innovation, the John Brown Volunteers, for on and on about 2 years at this point. Yeah. And
Wow.
We just got back from, sorry.
The time flies. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we just got back from an official delegation to Nicaragua for their elections. Yeah.
Wow. So you're a college student. Was this your first international trip? One of your first international trips?
Yes. First international trip certainly to an anti-imperialist country, to a country I'm proud to say I've been to. I did when I was I think 13. I went to Israel, which
interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know. Someone in Nicaragua told me, someone told me, who was one of kind of like our tour guides, and I told him I'd been to Israel. He's like, "Oh, so you haven't really been outside the United States before."
That's funny. Well, that's very good. It's exciting. You hear, young folks not only getting into socialism, but putting great work in and traveling the world and meeting comrades. It's absolutely inspired. I'm absolutely glad to have you here. Is there any way you could tell us a little bit, about, the build up getting to Nicaragua, when you were there, some of your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So, I got on a bus from Boston to New York City at the dawn of November. Met up with Caleb and then the John Brown Volunteers, and we went to the airport. There was some worry about like a COVID test technicality, but we got it resolved, or we thought we got it resolved at the New York airport, right? So then there was some question of whether are we going to be able to get on the plane to Mexico City or not, because it was a transfer, it's not a direct flight because of the sanctions. So we get to Mexico City, right, and we're about to board our plane, and they say there's a problem. They say, they say you're not approved by us. The Nicaraguans say you can come, but we Aeromexico, the airline, they said you're not approved through our system. So we get held up in Mexico City for like 2 days, staying in a little kind of hole in the wall motel. Honestly, it wasn't that bad a time. It was a little fun. Keaton Mansfield, he taught me how to play pool. So
Nice,
that was fun.
Nice.
So then we get new COVID tests and everything, because it has to be 72 hours from the flight, so they expired. We had to get new ones. And so we go to our flight. We made sure to go to the airport before, like the day before, to make sure like everything's going to be okay, because we'd heard, it wasn't just us who was having trouble getting in. It was many people, a lot of international activists, most notably Steve Sweeney of the Morning Star, who was detained in Mexico City. Like, we were held up. He was just straight up detained. So we get to the boarding area to get on our flight. A Nicaraguan customs guy has us on the list, right? He's like, you're good to go. Then we go to scan our tickets from Aeromexico. And the guy, he says, he's like, oh, sorry, we approve you to fly in, but the Nicaraguan government says you can't come. And we're like, hold on. We're in direct contact with the foreign ministry. They want us to come, and they're saying we're not approved. So we have to get the customs guy, the Nicaraguan guy, to argue with the Aeromexico guy to let us on the plane. And there was some sort of red text they had to override. So anyway, we ended up getting to Nicaragua, and it was beautiful, but a part of it was also surreal, because as anti-imperialists, socialists, we know the mainstream media lies through their teeth all the time. But being on the ground in Nicaragua, I was seeing it with my own two eyes. I was seeing opposition candidate advertisements, right? With pretty provocative language, like vote for so-and-so for freedom, vote for so-and-so for a change in the government. And then I see New York Times tweeting, all opposition is banned, there's no advertisements, and all the candidates are arrested. None of that is true. So it's kind of like a really clarifying thing. And there was a lot of hype in the U.S. media saying, oh, all these candidates were arrested. And then they walk it back and they say, they invent a new category. They say they were pre-candidates, which is basically they weren't candidates. And they were just kind of like they might run, and they were arrested for having ties with foreign NGOs. But there were 5 opposition candidates. So, the image we get from the U.S. mainstream media and the Western press in general is just a lie about Nicaragua.
Very powerful testimony. I mean, I'm looking at, we're kind of in a bubble. I mean, I listen, to Gray Zone, Black Agenda Report. I listen to Caleb, but we're kind of like in a bubble. I mean, all this mainstream, if you turn on Univision, is the worst. You turn on regular mainstream Spanish television, and the amount of lies against, the people. These are attacks, media attacks on their democracy, on their livelihood, to enforce neoliberalism, to destroy socialism. It's absolutely disgusting. It's absolutely wonderful that we got folks with the Center for Political Innovation and young folks like yourself out there telling people what's up. And this is a working class show. I got regular normies who ain't political watching this. You're from the South, you're from Georgia, for North Carolina. It's just good to get, this whole show is about working class solidarity. Workers and oppressed people unite. Maybe you can talk a little bit further on some of your experiences there, some of the work there, as well as some of the larger ideological concepts.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, when we first got there, the first day wasn't very active. We kind of just settled in and everything. But the next day was election day, and we were in Chinandega, the hottest part of Nicaragua on the the Pacific coast, right? So we go to different polling stations, and nothing really looks out of the ordinary, except for I guess you could say it was out of the ordinary in the sense that there weren't 8-hour lines to vote like there are in America, and there weren't people having trouble being able to vote like there is in America, and it seemed very transparent, free, open, and fair to us. So yeah, we went around Chinandega on election day, went back to the capital, Managua, and the next day, sorry, I'm mixing it up. So later that night, we went to the Supreme Electoral Council building, which is kind of like where they were going to have a press conference to announce the preliminary results. And we ended up waiting until about 3 a.m, and then they came out with the results, and Sandinistas, they killed it, they crushed it, and we went out right after, like 3:30 a.m, and there was like a giant rally for the Sandinistas, just out of the blue at 3:30 a.m, right? And we go there, we get some videos and stuff like that, and people are waving the FSLN flag. People are they're singing. They've got like songs specifically made for the Sandinistas, and it was really just amazing. And then the next day, it just kept getting better. We went to the Plaza de la Revolucion, the Plaza of the Revolution, just outside the presidential palace, and we heard the President Daniel Ortega give a speech. And while my Spanish is not the best, his speech, I think, was so powerful it crossed the language barrier. He was condemning imperialism. He was saying that Nicaraguas will never give up its sovereignty. The only way America will accept their elections is if the Americans can count their ballots like they did when they occupied the country into the 1930s. So yeah, we saw, we saw people having electricity. We saw people whose lives had, pretty rapidly gotten better in the past 10, 15 years since the Sandinistas came back into power. It was really interesting because, we talk about a government of action that fights for working families all the time. And, we saw that in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas are a government of action fighting for the working families in Nicaragua.
That is absolutely powerful. I mean, I've driven all 48 states, and I've seen these towns out here in the Midwest, talking about going around to Mississippi, and you see boarded up main streets, and as well as the Black Belt South and the Deep South. The only business left will be the convenience store that sells beers, cigarettes, lottery tickets, and the government building. And another one is the payday loan place, where they charge us 200-300% interest. Dilapidated infrastructure, streets with potholes. They close down all the local hospitals, and you got to go 20-30 miles to get decent medical care. I mean, our schools are falling apart. It's absolutely depressing. And I've seen our buying power go down. I've seen our infrastructure go down. And just to know and have people see it, just to hear live testimony about a society that isn't decaying, but is growing, that has hope, that has new schools, that has new roads, and has people who recently got put in the power. We go to our jobs and we get told to do, like you truck driver, you get told to do what dispatch. And if you don't do what dispatch tells you, we're during a kind of like a so-called driver shortage right now, so we might be able to hit them back a little bit. But usually you get told what to do and you got to do it. We ain't got barely any say over our government. We ain't got barely any say in our jobs, So I mean that's inspiring, that you're able to do that. Maybe you can talk anything else in particular that you found powerful or relatable in your experiences.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, another thing I noticed, which was really interesting, it was like, so obviously Nicaragua is not a wealthy country. They're a pretty poor country, but despite that, I didn't see the destitution that I see on the streets in New York City. Do you know what I mean? I didn't see like massive homeless camps like we have in America, even though people are living in, in some cases like huts, but those huts, more often than not, they have electricity and they have running water. And they were at the Sandinistas, they're actually giving people the deeds to the land they own. Whereas in America, a bank, if you live in a house, a bank owns it really, more often than not. But Nicaragua, the family owns the house. And just aside from the politics, it's just such a beautiful country. It's just such a beautiful country. I really, hopefully, we'll be going back soon. Can't say anything definitively at this point. But hopefully, yeah. I
think.
Oh, sorry. Go on. I
think you're raising a good point here. I often get into arguments with folks, and I start to talk with them. I was like, well, Nicaragua is still a poor country. I mean, it's so much better here. Even though it's falling apart, even we don't have say, we drive big old pickups. We got SUVs. We got, bigger houses, even though we're completely indebted, but I think the thing that people don't understand to be like, okay, we still got it better. So capitalism and Americanism or whatever the hell, is better. What people don't understand is imperialism. And it is hundreds of years of colonialism and imperialist exploitation that keeps Nicaragua, that has kept Nicaragua in poverty. And with the socialist revolution, people are able to escape that exploitation and build up their country. And I think that's a hard thing, to tell people when you're having this conversation. Let's open it up. David, any comments or questions for our guest?
Well, what's interesting, I'm most familiar with Nicaragua compared to what Lily is, of course, obviously, that that is, but what I've noticed so far is the level of participation at all levels of the population of the elections. It's not a matter of vote for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. We'll go to a polling booth and on election day or via postal vote, or however it's done. And then day after, okay, we'll announce the new president and the party that's in government. What I'm looking at this elections is just more than just the polling day itself. It's the lead up to it, it's the participating level, and even past that as well. When I've noticed it under a socialist government, that everyone, a campaign just doesn't end at an election time. It actually continues on further, and people are involved at all levels of government. And unlike here in Australia, where we have representational so-called democracy. The fact is, at the end of the day, what I'm seeing and I'll see Helen probably say a lot more on the Venezuelan side of it. The fact is, it's a lot more participating at all levels. So people are involved in the decision making. The people are involved in policy making. The whole lot. It's not just up to a few individuals or some political advisors in a political party making this in the first place. Did you find that in the contrast compared to what happens regardless in the US as well? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. Well, in Nicaragua, they have these things called citizens' power councils, which is kind of like, it seems like in every kind of socialist society, the USSR had the Soviets, China, they had people's communes, etc. And it's really an effort to bring kind of average people on like the more day-to-day level into like political decision making. Whereas in America, as you said, David, democracy is, in America and most of the Western democracies, you put a piece of paper in every 2 or 4 years, and and then you leave it at that, right? But in Nicaragua, they understand, like all socialist and anti-imperialist countries do, that they can't fulfill their mission without the active support and involvement of the people. And yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. People, people on the streets. I interviewed one woman at the polling station, kind of randomly, and I asked her about how she felt about the vote, and then she unprompted starts talking about how the Sandinistas have like really turned everything around. She grew up under Somoza. She was 70 years old, and she didn't go to school. She never learned to read, but she is seeing the new hospitals, the new schools, the new roads being built, and she's actually a merchant herself. Part of Nicaragua's Sandinista program is they're financing these micro entrepreneurs, like basically small business owners. They're but on like I guess a slightly smaller scale, but they're helping them, and they're helping to cultivate them. They talked about what they called the producer class, the productive class, sorry. And in that was and in that was included these small merchants, these micro entrepreneurs, and the working class. And right now, especially after 2018, when there was a coup attempt, basically, and kind of the, I guess, larger sort of medium to larger scale businesses and capitalists kind of proved they couldn't be trusted, and now their economy and political system is a lot more dependent on the small producers, basically.
Powerful, all power to the people. That's it sounds like that in action. Let's see, Helen, any comments or questions for Lily?
Oh, there are so many points of issue in there, and so many great things happening in Nicaragua and Latin America in general. And I think, Lily, what you said, what really struck home to me was that when you were describing yourself, as a kid that discovered socialism, that it made sense, and I think that's the thing that's of vital importance, is when something makes sense, it feels right and it sounds right, and I think that's what the Nicaraguan people are discovering as well, is that socialism feels right. And it makes sense, and they can see that through the changes in their material conditions, as you were describing. So, the whole thing starts to make sense to people, and we can't undo what we learn either, and that's the crucial thing. So once we start investigating how our system works, and we start to see these changes in other countries and so on, we can't undo that. We can't change that we've learned that information, and that's a really powerful tool for change in our own countries. Was there any conditions that the Western media kind of reported as being fraudulent in Nicaraguan elections? I mean, because that's the main claim they make against elections these days, isn't it?
So yeah, there were a ton of claims. There were claims that first they were saying all opposition candidates were banned, and then they kind of walked that back a little bit. And then they started saying instead that all the opposition candidates were controlled opposition, which I based on everything I saw, I don't think that's the case. There is opposition in Nicaragua. At the polling station, one of the women I talked to, just interviewing people, she said she was voting for the opposition. She said, she didn't like the Sandinistas, and she said it right by the police, right? And nothing happened. And she wasn't scared, she wasn't afraid. And there was also in a part of the country I wasn't in, but other people on our delegation were in. They were saying in one specific part they were closing polling stations just en masse, and people who were there said that's not true. All of them were open. I think they were even at like one specific polling station that I think the New York Times said was closed, and it wasn't. So yeah, it was a legitimate, free, fair election, but in the eyes of the Western media, it's only going to be legitimate, free, and fair if their interests win.
I've just got something else on that. You're talking about free, fair elections, because when they were mentioning about a lot of these opposition characters were banned from running elections, and make a note, they don't live in Nicaragua, or they live over in other respective countries, and I believe some are not even Nicaraguan at all. And I was interested. I was just sending a message before this live this morning. There is apparently, I won't mention the party, but it's a right-wing party, and they are running candidates in all seats in the next federal election, and obviously state elections, and obviously, but this candidate in particular doesn't live in the seat I live in. He lives somewhere in Melbourne, somewhere in a nice suburb and all that, but he's going to be the man for the ticket. And I just signed it. They're allowed to get away with. I'm not too sure about the US, but I mean they're sort of allowed to get away with it here in Australia. And I quite admire that for Nicaragua. And I said, no, you must be a citizen of the country and live here to run in the election. It's as simple as that. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be a common sense? But it sounds like the media and everyone and all the powers that be and ruling class in America, no doubt here in Australia, don't seem to like that for some unknown reason. And I think that's something that should learn a lesson from. If you're going to run an election, you have to live in the locality and be a part of that and citizen, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the candidates who were arrested, one of them particularly, Chamorro, I forget her first name, but her mother is actually, their family is kind of like a big kind of opposition oligarchical family, and her mother was actually the president that led Nicaragua into neoliberalism after the defeat of the Sandinistas in the 1990 election. Violeta Chamorro, she was in there, and then her daughter was being investigated by the Nicaraguan security authorities, and they were doing an audit of her, and $7 million was missing. And when they asked her about it, her response was, quote, USAID said it was okay. Which is, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. They're basically just acting as foreign agents of the United States. And another thing why they were arrested is they were going around the world, and to the United States in particular, and advocating sanctions on their own country. Imagine if like someone in America, I mean, it's not exactly the same because China is not a world hegemon, but imagine if someone in the United States was going around and going to China, like someone, prominent political figure in America was going to China and saying, like blockade our countries, like starve our people. I mean, I think our government, rightly so, would not allow that. And it's the same kind of concept in Nicaragua.
Very powerful. Were you there with CPI when Caleb and them defended against the Contras in the church?
Yeah, I was there. I was actually the one who filmed that encounter. But yeah, that was kind of a crazy interaction. It was a kind of a church mass service, and there were opposition type people who kind of got into the church and were like holding the Nicaraguan flag upside down or something. And then this girl was like asking the foreign minister, Dennis Moncada, like questions she thought were gotchas, but it was just like it didn't really ring with anybody. And we kind of got into a shouting match with them, and that was kind of crazy. At one point, they didn't really have any arguments. I don't know if in the video at one point, one of the Gusanos just started saying, like, they just started pointing themselves and saying, victim. Which I thought was kind of funny. Yeah, that was kind of a crazy interaction. And then, then we went to go get a repus around the corner afterwards.
Right on. So maybe we could put it into context. Some of the history of Nicaragua. You were saying in 1990, the Sandinistas lost and the neoliberals came back into power. Do you have a little bit more? We can all fill in the details. Maybe we could give a little bit of a story about it. First, starting back with a dictator up until the victory of the Sandinistas, and then the neoliberal period, and then them coming back into power.
Yeah, sure. So there was a dictator Somoza who was it was kind of like a family, not a monarchy, but it was the family ruling the country. It's kind of like an oligarchy. And the thing about Somoza was it wasn't even really like your typical kind of free market capitalism. And on that basis, there was a big division within Nicaraguan society, and a lot of society, the Nicaragua, opposed Somoza. And so it culminated in the 1978, 1979 Sandinista revolution. But when they first took power, it actually was not just the Sandinistas. It was called, I believe, the Junta for National Reconstruction. And it included many people, including kind of liberal center-right parties. And one of the people who was part of this Junta of National Reconstruction was Chamorro, the person who will come in later. But yeah, so immediately after that, the United States is like, oh, well, there's communists down south. What are we going to do? So they start funding the Contras, who are basically like narco terrorists, killing priests, killing nuns, blowing up schools, hospitals, roads, trying to sabotage every effort of the Sandinistas to improve their people's lives. Their atrocities were so publicized and so like blatantly, just like no one could support this, that U.S. Congress actually banned funding of the Contras, and which caused Ronald Reagan to sell weapons to Iran and the Iran Contra scandal to fund it back into the Contras, as well as pushing drugs on primarily the Black community, Oliver North and all that. So then after 10 years of civil war, basically, the United States tells Nicaragua that if you vote out the Sandinistas, we'll leave you alone, basically. And so the people, a combination of they're tired of civil war, the economy is not doing too well in 1990 with all the sanctions and 10 years of destruction. So the opposition wins, and they stay in power for about 15 years on the basis of basically, if you vote the Sandinistas, you'll get violence, when it was the opposition who was doing the violence, right? So, but ultimately, conditions with neoliberalism and all that, conditions, as it did across Latin America, they deteriorated to a point where even within the capitalist class in Nicaragua, there was a division. And, on that basis, Daniel Ortega came back into power in 2006, and the Sandinistas came back into power, and, they're not doing it exactly how they did before. There are multiple parties. There are, it's not a completely state-run economy. There is a market economy. But ultimately, they're still kind of constructing the vision of Sandinismo, of, socialism. Sandinismo based on the hero of Nicaragua, Augusto C. Sandino, who fought against the U.S. Marines occupying Nicaragua and was killed by Somoza's, I believe, his father in 1934, I think. Yeah. So since then, when Ortega came back into power in 2006, 2007, because of various factors, the Bolivarian kind of anti-imperialist countries were still messed with, obviously, but there was a period for, about early 2000s to 2013 or so, up until around when Hugo Chavez died, that the United States was kind of, they weren't hands off, but they were a little more gentle to these countries. But since then, they've kind of ramped it up. And yeah, Nicaragua has strengthened its ties with Venezuela, Cuba, with the anti-imperialist camp, Bolivia, and yeah.
You touched on the 2018 U.S.-backed attempted coup of their government and violence in the streets. Did you hear any personal testimony or anything regarding that event?
Mm-hmm. I heard the little bit of personal testimony was it's not what you would expect from a personal testimony, but there were these kind of brick type old fashioned looking roads, and one of the Sandinistas said, yeah, we call these Somoza bricks. And in 2018, they said they tore up these roads to make the opposition to make barricades to try, like, you know, because they were trying to do kind of like a coup, some sort of like guerrilla warfare. And there was unrest in the country for a couple months until, you know, eventually peace and order was restored. But since then, you know, I think 70 people were killed, 72. But yeah, it was tragic. And, you know, this time they were prepared for it. You know, they had security forces. They were, you know, they were not going to let the United States try anything again.
So, I mean, this is, it's absolutely twisted in the U.S. media. If you look at the U.S. media going back to 2018, they say the evil dictator Ortega is killing his own people because they want democracy. And in reality, the U.S. was manipulating social media, funding violent extremists to overthrow their democratically elected government. That was the reality that was going on. And they dealt with that. And didn't they even pardon some of the people that were involved with that? I mean, the amount of restraint and that the Sandinista government has shown is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak on the pardoning. I'm not aware of that. That could be the case, but yeah, it really is kind of insane. And now in the United States, they're trying to play the U.S. media. I've seen them try to play it both ways, right? He's a radical, crazy communist dictator, and then I've also seen that he has become a centrist dictator, and I've seen people saying that he is the thing he fought to destroy. He's become like Somoza, you know, kind of the Trotskyite kind of oh my god. All right, well, it's Keaton saying something. I guess I'll talk on this.
Okay.
There was on the restraint of the Sandinistas. Thank you, actually, that reminded me. But so one of the Sandinistas was telling us, he was saying, you know, back in 2018, all of the supporters, all the Sandinistas were basically, you know, kind of in the mindset like to Ortega, just say the word and we'll do it, you know, like we'll go take care of them. And you know, the Sandinistas, they wouldn't do it. They did not, because they knew it would be a bloodbath, and they didn't want that, and they wanted you know, to maintain peace however possible. But you know, their supporters are very, very dedicated, and they were fully ready to, you know, if the government gave the word, they were ready to defend the revolution. But cooler heads prevailed, and luckily so, right? And yeah, it was really interesting.
Very, very powerful. So now they've recently had an election, and they had a victory. The people are ready to defend it, and they're making progress. Absolutely beautiful. Now, earlier in the show, you mentioned that you had visited Israel. Are you of Jewish background or Jewish?
Yes.
Now, I understand that Nicaragua is a almost officially Christian country. I'm not sure how exactly that works, but did you face any repression as someone from a Jewish background in Nicaragua?
No, in fact, I actually saw the Jewish Star of David a lot of places. I'm not sure if maybe it means something different there, but I saw that a lot. And I also saw the Israeli flag a fair bit, which kind of like disturbed me a little bit. I was like, what is this? But I don't know. Maybe, again, with the Star of David, maybe it means something else. But no, I didn't experience any discrimination as in Nicaragua, both as a Jewish person and as a transgender person, right? You know, they're also very socially conservative there. And, you know, I mean, some people knew, some people didn't. But I was treated with respect and, you know, cordiality. You know, I didn't experience anything like that.
Right on. That's very powerful. And I don't know if you practice, but happy Hanukkah as well to you and your family. Let's see. Is there anything else before we move on? Any other questions or thoughts on Nicaragua?
I think you've actually covered a fair bit of ground, and it's been very educational. There's a lot, especially here in Australia, not mention Nicaragua to the common person, they wouldn't really know much about that at all. There'll be a few people in the know, but I think it's good to know actually what this is actually quite inspirational, that there is an alternative out there, instead of just having to say, well, this is as good as it's going to get. This is how it is, and we're supposed to be the most freest nation on earth, which we're not, far from it. And I think it comes to show that there is an alternative. There's it's socialism, and it works. It is in practice. It's got difficulties in front of it, and every system has got difficulties, but it just comes to show when someone turns around socialism never worked, well, there it is in living form. It's working. Simple as that. Mm-hmm.
All right. Maybe before we go on, Helen, did you have anything to add?
Oh no, you're that was fantastic. Extremely extensive knowledge on the history of Nicaragua, so it's fantastic. I knew a little bit about it actually because it was one of the first things that occurred when I was a young, 15-year-old. The Sandinistas took power, and I remember a poster of a woman with and Nicaragua's revolution was, I think it was extremely young. There were only, the average age of people in Nicaragua was 21 or something. So a really young revolution, and it had there was a poster of a young woman with a gun over her shoulder, and she was breastfeeding her baby at the same time, and underneath it said, basically, I can't be free if my man is not free. So, and it was just a wonderful example of the way that people were thinking about their country. As I say, I knew a little bit about it, but your extensive knowledge was fantastic.
Yeah, it's very. I'm very glad to have such a bright young comrade with extensive knowledge. That's amazing. Maybe I can talk a little bit about some of the cultural and some of the history with solidarity efforts. It seems as if in the 1980s with Reagan, and Helen can attest to this, that there was a huge reaction even amongst liberals against Reagan. So it opened up some of the door for more mass support with Nicaragua. And you have country singers like the great Chris Christopherson, who was also an actor, played in trucking movies. He had this song, Sandinista, Sandinista, you can hold your head up high. You've taken back your freedom. This beautiful country singer singing solidarity with the Nicaraguan people. And then it seemed like, after they were taken out of power and after decades, went on, and kind of the, this whole era of neoliberalism, when they came back in 2006, there wasn't this support. There wasn't as mass support for the Nicaraguans among the left, and a lot of people who call themselves so-called progressives believe a lot of the lies. Democracy Now!, which was good in the Bush years against the war in Iraq, repeats the same lies about Nicaragua as other places. So we have our work cut out to educate not only the masses and the working class, but even the left is kind of far gone. Honestly, I think it's easier, and a lot of times it is easier to educate a regular so-called normie working class person that's struggling about the people in Nicaragua than it is some of this brainwashed faux left, synthetic left. I believe Helen Woolley, maybe you could talk a little bit about that observation of the waning in solidarity with Nicaragua.
Oh, look, I work with a person who has a history of the Trotskyist movement. They kind of, interesting that the Trotskyist movement here in Australia is kind of saying they're no longer Trotskyists, they're just socialists. They kind of moved away from actually saying that Trotsky was right. But her history is in this Trotskyist movement. And very interesting when we're talking about Nicaragua, and it was a brief, fleeting comment about the elections, because I think we were talking about the Venezuelan elections at the time. And she just stuck in there something about Ortega and how bad he is for the country in Nicaragua. And I just thought, are you joking? And the conversation ended. I didn't get a chance to discuss it. It was, one of those fleeting comments that you hear. And I just thought that is so typical of the history of the Trotskyists. They loved the Nicaraguan revolution when it started, because it had all of this flavor of, young and anti-imperialist, and it looked like it was going to be something different from the old style of the Soviet and Stalinist kind of era and so on. So they endorsed it fully, but now they've just discarded it as a bourgeois nationalist movement sort of thing that isn't going to go anywhere. So yeah, it's as you say, Dust. It's harder to convince the left than it is to convince ordinary people of the good things that are happening around the world.
Very powerful. So before we go on to Helen's work with Venezuela, also about the Venezuelan elections, I just want to get a broader, picture on Latin America. And I'm heavily influenced by the Center for Political Innovation. And this book, We Are City Builders, the essay City Builders and Vandals, was a huge progression in my ideological understanding in recent years. I have an anti-revisionist background, which was principled when they, broke away, when the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists and some Maoists broke away from the CPUSA because they were basically absorbed by the Democrats. But they became isolated. And they also, I believe, did not fully recognize, the anti-imperialist struggles and, 21st century socialism that had happened afterwards. They like to stick to, Stalin or Mao or Hoxha, and they don't really give, I believe, the Bolivarian movement, 21st century socialism, the struggles in Iran, the struggles in Syria. They don't give them their full due. Comrade Fox.
Yeah, I actually like to make comment, because that we've come across that with some of them here. Not everyone that comes from a Marxist-Leninist background, but there are those few that get very dogmatic and they say, well, it's not socialism. They haven't done this, and this to even, and it's like, well, there isn't actually no blueprint for it. And so there's the other extreme when you get the ultra-left position where you get the dogmatic position as well. And it's interesting in saying that you've got the Trotskyists one way, and then you've got the dogmatists on the other. So the left and right go hand in hand, I suppose, in that sense. And you get very little unity. So they haven't done this, so therefore it's not socialist. They haven't done that, therefore it's not socialism. And therefore it's not like this. And sometimes this is what gets under my skin, but I like to put to them, they ever led a revolution, have they? Have they ever tried to do this? And you find all of them have never led anything. They never participated with the majority of people. They're totally on the fringes. They're cringe themselves, to use that term, and very isolating. And I won't mention, he that won't be named, a YouTube commentator, but he takes that, Dust probably knows who I'm really talking about, but he shall forever remain unnamed. But yeah, at the end of the day, he takes that dogmatic, and this is the problem, is he takes that position and he's really further and further isolating himself, not realising every country's got their own development, a key level of development everywhere. Conditions in Nicaragua are totally different from what they are, say, for example, here in Australia, and everything else. So it depends on the level of development where everything's at the moment. So, I mean, it's really what I see, what's happening in Nicaragua. I know, no doubt too, and also congratulations to the people of Honduras as well. One big step forward. It's a step forward, quantitative to a qualitative change. And I think that's some of the people that are dogmatic forgotten about that. Things are, you have all these little quantitative changes that lead to a qualitative one, and certain things have to be put in place first. And look, I like to quote Lenin, like one step forward, two steps back at times. But it's what I'm saying is, and I think it's a fantastic thing to do, and I like to say this to the dogmatists out there who like to disagree with me. Well, you want to explain that into ordinary people and see what you're going to get. But I like to actually say the positives. They're heading in the right direction. Venezuela, Nicaragua, now Peru, Ecuador, and Honduras. Congratulations, and no doubt around the world they are heading in that way. And there is no one blueprint, no one path to head towards. It depends on what the material conditions and circumstances in everyone's respective countries.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'll just briefly go over some of the changing conditions in Latin America. When we think about like the iconic revolutionary, we think about Che Guevara, and Che Guevara was a guerrilla fighter. I can get more into his history, but we see the beret, we see the rifle, we see Fidel Castro and the military fatigues, and then out of that same vein of this, the guerrilla style warfare, we see the Sandinistas, coming to power. We see the young woman breastfeeding her child with the bullets or gun across her back or chest, and that hasn't been what has happened. We basically had dictatorships in Latin America during Reagan, and before that. And the only way there was no space for democracy. You would get disappeared. I mean, if you tried to organize the people. But then, the imperialists got a better tactic. They could just as easily, if not more effectively, rob the people of Latin America with neoliberal regimes that allowed the pretense of, under neoliberalism, they have to allow some democratic activity to go on to stabilize and make people think that neoliberalism is a good thing. So it completely changed the conditions. And we saw that, going into the 1990s, late 1980s, late 1990s, there wasn't another successful guerrilla revolution. We had horrible atrocities, like in Peru with the Shining Path, where this need to, be the great revolutionary with the gun, fall into absolute horror, both state repression and violent acts by the people that were saying they were fighting for revolution. And then what we had was was it 1999, I believe, when Hugo Chavez came to power. He didn't come to power through guerrilla warfare. He came to power through a mass coalition and a mass anti-neoliberal coalition, which included both the poorest of the country, along with some of the small business and some of the nationalist bourgeoisie that saw the neoliberal order was hurting them for the benefit of the monopoly capitalist imperialists in the United States. And then we had in 2000, I think it was 2005, Evo Morales came to power, mass anti-neoliberal coalition. And then in Nicaragua was interesting because Nicaragua, they came to power on a guerrilla revolution, lost power in the neoliberal period, and then came back to power on an anti-neoliberal coalition government. And that, that seems to be the way things are going in Latin America. And for to be a dogmatist, and to be in the United States and not see the full value, or say that's not real socialism, of oppressed people building up in their country and escaping imperialism, it is Western chauvinism. It is absolutely disgusting, and it's absolutely wonderful to have young, enlightened, educated comrades like Comrade Lilly out there showing solidarity. And I think this is the plea we got to make to the up-and-coming working-class socialist movement. Just how I broke it down, plain, straight-out words. These are people, just as we are oppressed as workers in the United States, we lose a portion of our sovereignty as human beings against the monopoly capitalist system, their whole nation, they're not even given their own, they maybe they can have their flag, but their entire economic system is built up to help the United States. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. I mean, I know I raised a lot here. Maybe we can go into some more hopeful things. Lily, earlier before I asked you about the elections in Honduras, and David touched on it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the progress in Honduras.
Sure. Well, so the elections in Honduras just last Sunday, I believe, about a week ago, saw Xiomara Castro, the wife of the ex-socialist president Manuel Zelaya, who was deposed in the 2009 coup with Hillary Clinton and all of that. She has just won power, and she's done it kind of on the same basis what you were talking about, the anti-neoliberal coalition. Honduras has suffered really greatly under the right-wing kind of post-coup government, and corruption's flourished, poverty has been soaring, and she has come into power on a coalition. And one of the first things she did after winning was saying she's going to eradicate corruption. And then Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, congratulated her on her victory, and she says, "Gracias, Presidente Maduro." Thank you, President Maduro, which might not sound that significant, but based on what's going on in the imperialist camp, not even recognizing Nicolas Maduro as the president, that's kind of sending a signal that they will be moving in a more anti-imperialist direction, kind of like Argentina under the Peronists, or Mexico under AMLO. So it's we will have to see how it develops, of course, but judging on what I've seen so far, it's looking pretty good.
Very good. So let's talk a bit about Venezuela. I understand, Helen Woolley, you had plans to go there that did not work out. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, as well as what happened there with the election.
Sure. Yeah, I was invited by the Venezuelan embassy here in Canberra, in Australia, to attend the elections in Venezuela on the 21st of November, as part of a delegation, international observers to Venezuela, because, of course, over the years, every election that's been held, and certainly for Nicolas Maduro, the Western world has claimed that every election has been fraudulent. And so, they've failed to recognize Maduro as the legitimate government, and choose instead to recognize Guaido, who is unelected and self-proclaimed as the president of Venezuela. So I was invited to attend that as a observer. There were about 300 international observers that went to Venezuela. 130 of those were from the EU, and I think that's significant in and of itself, and that the European Union is being hampered by US imperialism, and I think there's moves in the European Union to try and have trade with various countries around the world. We see that they're opening their trade with China, for instance, and with Russia, and even going to Venezuela might indicate that they're prepared to recognize the government of Maduro, as opposed to what the United States is saying, which is we're not going to recognize. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Venezuela, and I was bitterly disappointed. But I have been there before, much to my pleasure, and found it to be, like Lily, just surreal and just an amazing experience. The people are so supportive of their system. there, and in fact, there was a representative of the government, and I had a quote from her, and it was only online, but she said, if there's any chance of taking over the government of Venezuela, it has to be by elections. There is no way that by military force that the system will fail, that the system will fall. There is no way that United States, by entering into a war situation, or Colombia coming, paramilitaries coming across the Colombian border, there is no way that kind of behavior is going to lead to a change in the system. There will be no regime change through war. And so what she was saying was that, anybody that wants to change the system has to win the elections. And that's important, because what Guaido now recognizes is that as a result of them participating in this current elections, which in the past they've always boycotted, but they realize that also has been a mistake, and that they've lost so much ground from even their supporters. So what he kind of recognizes is that the right wing is very disorganized and has no unity. And coming out of that election, he said, "Oh well, now we have to get organized, and we have to be unified." So the right is coming to the conclusion that Maduro is the legitimate president, that there is no way that they're going to take over this country and revert it back to capitalism unless they win the elections. And that's interesting, because they've not done that in the past.
That's very powerful. You talk about, the people building socialism. What is the name of the group, the community group that builds local power?
Yeah, they're called the comunas, and they came out of the election of Hugo Chavez. So that was a really important part of what he wanted to make sure that they were a central core of their democracy. So one of the things that Chavez did, of course, was he nationalized the key industry. That was one of the first things that he kind of did. They had a new constitution in about 2000. The new constitution came in, and the first thing they did was nationalize key industry. The other thing they set up was the comunas, and they called that participatory democracy. And so central to the whole 21st century socialism is this key idea of participatory democracy. And that, as you say, that's been called different things in other countries. The Soviets were participatory democracy. It was grassroots level democracy taking place, and it's becoming more and more a key element of the fight for socialism, is this idea of participatory democracy versus representative democracy that we have in the West. And in fact, I understand that Joe Biden is hosting some kind of big summit coming up to do with democracy, discussing democracy, because it's becoming a key issue around the world. People are saying that democracy doesn't just mean going to the polls every 4 years and electing one or the other of these people that have millions of dollars behind them and backing and so on. And so the examples of the developing world and the socialist world is that there's a different type of democracy available to the people. And that's very prevalent, and it was a key component of what Chavez wanted to establish in Venezuela.
So maybe if we could do a similar thing that we did with Honduras, and talk a little bit about the history of Venezuela. And my understanding, before 1999, we'll start there. They had a very ruthless neoliberal regime, mass poverty. And there was a mass anti-neoliberal coalition, that put Hugo Chavez in the power. And they started, they started building people houses. They took over their natural resources, nationalized the oil, their main resource. There's some criticism of depending too much on oil and not increasing other sectors. But what people don't understand is during the Bush regime, there was an attempted coup. I mean, so these people are building socialism while having coups attempted against them. And so there was things were very heated when I was in high school. The Iraq War was going on. Venezuela was opposed to the wars. I think Hugo Chavez once said it smelled like sulfur when George Bush was around. There was a very heated
I remember that
competition, like between the two. And I believe, it was a good. I think some people criticize Chavez because they say that he was a little bit too nice towards Obama because it doesn't smell like sulfur. But I mean, he's trying to do what he's trying to do. If he can get on good terms and they can just be left alone, their whole civilization, their whole country, their whole economy is constantly under attack. So there was this kind of idea that Obama wouldn't be as harsh or is aggressive towards Venezuela, but Obama was just more effective and more ruthless in many ways in attacking the people. And then with the death of Chavez in 2013, there was a crash in oil prices in 2014, and there was also they depended on the U.S. to get a lot of their food products. And there was outright sabotage where U.S. Based companies or companies that worked with the U.S. Holding basic food supplies and attempting to starve the people of Venezuela into submission. And that happened in 2014. And then just recently, under the Trump regime, we had private military contractors try to go in and perform a military coup, and they were stopped by black fishermen who defended their country with guns against these renegade mercenaries. Maybe you can talk a little bit. I said a bunch of the history, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the history of Venezuela in the current period.
Yeah, just before you do, Helen, those fishermen. I was just going to. I thought I'd love to, mate, if I had contact with those fishermen at the time. I said, you don't need to buy any bait. You've got the bait. You've just caught it.
That's right. You've just caught it. Yeah. Well, yeah, and those people up in that region, I'm pretty sure were part of the Revolutionary Bolivarian movement, which is what Chavez was part of, and prior to his election in 1999. So he established that, and in 1992, that movement was the key organization involved in attempting to overthrow the government at that time. And of course, it was a failed coup attempt. And Chavez was jailed for a number of years for that attempt. And at the time, and I think a lot of people quote the fact that at the time he stood up and said to the people of Venezuela, he apologized for it and took full responsibility for the failure of that coup. And for a lot of people, that was unheard of in terms of Venezuelan politics, that somebody would stand up and say, apologize in the first place, and then also take responsibility for something that had failed. Because, and as we know, under in our own regimes and in our own countries, politicians very rarely say sorry and very rarely are able to take responsibility for something that's occurred. And so that made Chavez extremely popular in Venezuela. And apart from the fact that, as you say, it was a neoliberal financial system that was just crushing the people enormously. And I think one of the key things that was the tipping point for revolutionary change in Venezuela was the increase in bus fares. And it was just enough to push people over the edge and say enough is enough. We can't tolerate this situation. And so, of course, that was in 1999. Chavez took power, and and as I say, a new constitution came into being in 2000. And if you read that constitution, it's an absolutely fantastic description. I think it's got 250 articles, and it's a fantastic description of how the revolution is going to benefit the people through all sorts of mechanisms and through all sorts of concepts of equality and fairness. And when we look at our own countries and look at the constitutions of our countries, in the Australian Constitution, nowhere does it say anything about the people. It only talks about the parliamentary system, about how you're able to elect a government, but it doesn't refer to the people as such. And in fact, in terms of our First Nations people, it doesn't recognise any of their rights as a people. And in fact, they didn't even get citizenship until the 1960s here in Australia. Prior to that, the Indigenous people of Australia were considered part of the flora and fauna of this country. Yeah. So I think, and the reason I raise that is it's so important to talk about Venezuela and Nicaragua and so on, but at the same time, we have to draw those parallels with what's going on with our own country compared to what's going on with these socialist countries, and how they refer to their people and how they look after and care about their people is of vital importance to so that people in our own countries can see the difference in the nature of the systems that we live under.
Very, very powerful. I mentioned earlier it was black fishermen who defended the country. And this is a trend that you see with the oppression of African people in the Americas. Just what was it, Barbados, which was like little England, just finally got their independence from the crown. Something Australia and Canada are still behind on. But if we look at in Nicaragua, I believe there's an autonomous region with Afro-Indigenous people who have their own region. And then and I look at pictures of the Venezuelan government, and I see black, indigenous, and black and brown people. And I'm living in North Carolina. This is the Black Belt South. We have one of the largest black populations in the country, and the majority of the representatives are white. And and we have voter suppression. We have the voter ID laws. We have gerrymandering. And what made those governments mostly white is disenfranchising black voters. And I look at a picture of the Venezuelan government, I see the exact opposite. I see indigenous and black people holding political power. So I often say power, we need to fight for, build, and defend political and economic power of poor black and brown people. And that is exactly what they're doing, and it's absolutely beautiful. Go ahead, Comrade Fox.
Yeah, well, see, in the parallels here for Australia, I mean, the Indigenous population, I mean, they're still trying. There's still a massive campaign to actually have a treaty with our Indigenous population. I mean, we haven't even got to that far. It was just as history has shown, it was a clear invasion of their lands. I mean, the Indigenous population here, or First Nations, they had civilization. They actually did live in towns and villages. They were an agricultural society. Everyone was led to believe they were a hunter and gatherer. No, they're actually agricultural society. They developed all these things, and yes, they had all different languages, and they had a way of expressing it both with orally and through their particular of writing, through particular painting, etc. That's a completely whole different concept, and how they come about. But they came along this obviously Western chauvinism. It came out of the imperialist. It came out of imperialism that say we had to civilise. Everything else, and our system was much more civil, and that was imposed on them and nearly wiped them out. But then, as I said, to this day in Australia, we're still trying to give them the actual recognition that we should be actually signing a treaty, a proper treaty too, not something that's half watered down. A proper treaty to recognise it was their country, it was their land in the first place, and they had no right. And the original invaders here had no right to do what they had to do, and recognise that. And what I'm seeing it happen in Venezuela, elsewhere, is completely different whole system of what they've got. And just interesting, I've got the Eureka flag just right behind as my background. And we talked about this is the 167th anniversary of the Eureka Rebellion and what it meant to us. And it was discussed on Friday morning on that particular on the anniversary of the battle itself. The fact is, the end of the day, we've still got a long way to go for us here in Australia, even under this called system. We call ourselves a modern democracy, a modern nation, and all this. We're a long way off to where we should be compared to where I'm looking at the likes of Venezuela and Nicaragua, etc. All these other countries around the world. Helen, I don't know if what you've got to comment on that, but that's what I'm saying. So far, what we're seeing here in Australia compared to Venezuela. I think Venezuela's in a much more advanced. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the elections, they hold elections for Indigenous people separately. It's a day later, and they organise their own elections within the confines, if you like, of the normal election process, but they do it in a way that is traditional to themselves within the context of their cultural and traditional ways of electing people and so on. And they elect them to be the representatives in the National Assembly and so on. So rather than like in Australia, you have to stand as a candidate with a major political party essentially to be elected. The Indigenous people and that makes it in Australia, that makes it very, very difficult for Indigenous people to stand as candidates because, of course, they don't normally get the backing, they don't get the pre-selection and so on. Whereas in Venezuela, it's a separate election. It's an election for the Indigenous people. They have the right to conduct those elections in a manner that is, in the context of their traditional and cultural ways of doing things and so on. And so that's a huge advancement for those people. And I just want to run through a couple of the figures of the Venezuelan elections. To describe, in order to understand when we talk about democracy in the socialist world, in Venezuela they had these were the regional elections that took place on the 21st of November. There were 3,000 positions being contested for governor and mayor positions. And of those 3,000 positions, they had something like 60,000 candidates that wanted to stand as independents or as party members. They had opposition that were standing and so on. And what happened, what you had to do in order to be able to stand as a candidate, you had to go out to the people. You had to put your case to the people to then get a series of votes to say that you could stand in the elections. So I think it would be unheard of in Australia to have 60,000 candidates wanting to stand. For one, wanting to even stand in the elections, and two, then going out to the people and being chosen to be a candidate, and then thirdly, actually running your campaign in the seats that you were, or the positions that you were vying for. What else is unique about those countries? About Venezuela, there was a low turnout. It was 41.8% of the people voted. But that's not necessarily, it's slightly lower than what has traditionally been the amount of people that turn out for elections. There's a number of reasons for that. The COVID for a start, the fact that it's very difficult to get transport because of the fuel situation in Venezuela. So a number of reasons. But the majority voted for the PSUV, the United Socialist Party candidates. They took out, if there's any idea that they didn't win fairly, or that they were somehow the people were forced to vote for them, they did take out 22 of the 24 seats. or 21 of the 24 seats, and a Communist Party took out one of the regional seats. So that basically means that from the left that they took out 22 of the 24 seats. The right wing only won seats in the kind of traditional wealthy areas, and that's all that they could claim. The opposition, of course, have said that the elections are fraudulent, that Maduro was always going to win, that it wasn't a fair election. The EU observers have all said that they were extremely fair elections. There was no discrepancies. They have a system where you go in, you show your ID, you make your vote. It's an electronic system. You make your vote. You get a printout of who you voted for, the time, the date, all of the rest of it, and so it's all computerized. It's I guess there are ways that you could make that fraudulent, but the actual technical side of the elections, it cannot be claimed to be fraudulent. The other side of it is that most countries have three parts to their system. Venezuela has 5, so there's or branches rather. So in Australia, for instance, and in the United States, we've got an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch of the government. And in Venezuela, they also have what they call a morals power, and they also have an electoral power. So they call all 5 of those powers. And of course, what that means is that electoral process is scrutinized by everybody in the system, or especially by the government bodies that also oversight or oversee the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. So they've added layers to their system to make it even more democratic, especially in terms of the way and the processes that elections are held and so on. So again, any claims by the Western media that these elections are fraudulent are just absolutely are wrong on all sorts of levels.
Very powerful. Earlier I mentioned there was a kind of a breakdown between larger support from the left and progressives in Nicaragua, during the first time of them reigning, when they came to power through guerrilla. But now, if we look at Venezuela, there was a lot of support for Chavez, even amongst some Trotskyites. But then after Chavez died, and then after the brutal media campaign, and then Maduro came to power, I think there's been a hesitation by some of these, Western leftists, more petty bourgeois leftists, to not support Maduro. Have you noticed that as a problem as well?
Absolutely. Again, it's that thing of as you were saying about Che Guevara and Castro. There's this element of romanticism and this element of ultra leftism, because it was a guerrilla war that was being taken, that was occurring in Cuba and then in Nicaragua later and so on. That guerrilla war aspect, the Trotskyists really love, and the left really love, because it's this romantic image of what revolution should be and the destruction that revolution should be doing, the destruction of the system. And Chavez kind of fitted into that because he was part of the military, and he had that failed coup attempt, and so that kind of elevated him to the position of a guerrilla hero. But then Maduro comes along, and he has to take over and cement this revolution even further into the people, and have to deal with these sanctions that are being imposed on Venezuela, and that they were harsher sanctions than what Chavez had to deal with. because of the price of oil at the time and so on. So I'm smiling at that comment as well. So
spot on.
Maduro has more to deal with as a result of the sanctions that were imposed by the United States. And again, if you're leading a revolutionary country, you know, the thing that you have to consider is the position of the people. How it would be so easy for the right wing to gain popularity if the material conditions of the people aren't continually improving. And so that's Maduro, that's the government's task in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba. The key task is to ensure that the people's position in society is always improving. And how can you do that? Sometimes it means that you have to join forces with people that it may only be a temporary position that you take with people that you don't particularly like, or that, let's say, the left doesn't particularly like, and you're forced into making concessions in some ways, and that's simply a fact of reality. And I think we're beginning to understand that much more now than what we saw in the past. We're beginning to understand that it's not necessary. It's one step forward, two steps back. We have to make concessions where we need to ensure, one, that we're not attacked by the imperialist countries, and two, so that we're continually improving the position of the people in our countries. And that's what socialism stands for, is the development of a better society. How can we do that if we don't fulfill the needs of the people? So I think the Maduro government is doing an absolutely fantastic job in the face of these sanctions that they're having to deal with and so on. They can't get economic aid. They can't. Every single financial transaction is tracked by the imperialist financial system. They can't they can't freely trade with countries. They can't buy things. They can't buy medicines and so on. So every transaction is an ordeal for them. It's not as simple as just simply signing a contract and bingo, we'll have this trade and we'll have ships coming in. No, it's not that simple for them. So in the face of this enormous adversity from imperialism, they're doing an absolutely fantastic job. And of course, the more countries that are becoming socialist and friendly towards the likes of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and the weaker US imperialism is becoming. And of course, the ugly side of that is that how does US imperialism get its position back in terms of the world leader? Generally, as we understand it, it's normally through war. And so that's something that the working class of the world have to recognize, is that, do we want another war? Do we want to keep going to war for imperialism?
Very powerful testimony. We're approaching the end. I said I wouldn't have this go over an hour and a half. I think we're going to go into a round of final conclusions. The name of the show today is Workers and Oppressed Peoples Unite. And that is exactly what we're doing here. This is Working Class Revolt. I'm a truck driver. David Fox is a labor representative, a Boilermaker. Helen Woolley, fellow driver, worked in the mines. A young student with us, Lily. And, we're grassroots. We're on the ground. And we're saying, we stand in it because of the oppression we face. This ain't some kind of liberal, care. Charity's good, but it's kind of liberal. Look at the poor kids in Africa and, oh my God, they're hurting them dogs and we got to do something about it to feel better about ourselves. That's not what the fuck we're doing. We are seeing that we face oppression by the monopoly capitalists, the same group of oil bankers that keeping us down here are keeping the oppressed nations down. And the people there are rising up and doing something about it. And we are inspired by it. It's absolutely beautiful. A little bit about my background. I am an economic refugee. I call Northern Appalachia, South Central upstate New York, nothing but hay fields and dairy farms out there. And NAFTA, kind of put some of the rural communities out of business, under. There was a massive monopolization of agriculture, destroyed, small communities. And then we were forced down south. And at the time we were forced down south, there was also a huge, massive migration from Mexico, along with, there was refugees from the neoliberalism in Honduras. There was, the neoliberalism in Guatemala. I worked alongside Guatemalan workers. And, not having, before I got my trade in truck driving, I work as a day laborer. And I work beside documented and undocumented, diaspora, Hondurans, Guatemalans, even some Venezuelans. And I became educated in socialism, and I had people go to Venezuela, and I heard, I had friends close to me go to Venezuela and tell me stuff. And then I'd be sitting on the line talking with undocumented workers, and they're talking, and a lot of them was repeating the same crap from Univision and a lot of the lies, they went through horrible stuff, and I actually wanted to give a shout out to Ramiro, for working along with educating the diaspora from Latin America is absolutely powerful. But I think our mission here on Working Class Revolt is to, educate the working class and educate, the poorest of the workers that are working alongside in the same factories, as the diaspora. And looking at our conditions, and looking up to, first off, we got to dispose all the lies, and then we can look up to the political and economic power of poor Black and brown people that's being built in Nicaragua, it's being built in Venezuela. And then look at that and use scientific socialism. Look at the conditions we face and make an neoliberal coalition to fight for power here that stands in solidarity and from the belly of the beast tells this government that you are not going to attack the people of Venezuela and you are not going to attack the people of Nicaragua because they are us. Because the same way you hold us down here, you're trying to hold the people down there. Let's see, David Fox, any concluding remarks?
Well, that was fantastic presentations both from Lily and Helen. I think it's actually demonstrates that there is another way possible. We can actually draw a lot of lessons from what's happening in Central and South America as well, and then maybe have a look at ways we can move forward. We're talking about late 1990s. There was a massive anti-globalization mobilizations, especially in the US. We had 1999, the Battle of Seattle. A year later, we had the World Economic Forum in Melbourne 2000, where we blockaded up. They had thousands, tens and thousands of people. We literally blockaded up the city nearly against all this neoliberal agenda and imperialist agenda. And then obviously September 11 came along and ruined it for everyone. But I mean, the fact is, at the end of the day, I think it's something we can draw these lessons learned. I said we do have to unite. It's actually we do need to get above the left and right divide as well and realise it's a class issue. And that all the issues have been effective is a class issue, and we're going to have to align with people. So at times that we're going to disagree with on a number of matters, but we need to actually. I'm going to quote Chairman Mail, and especially for the ultras out there, we need to broaden the base and narrow the target. If you remember that, ultras, broaden the base and narrow the target, because the reality is, at the end of the day, the world is in a dire situation. We are actually ourselves in the imperial bloc, which Australia is part of. How can we call ourselves being free and fair and wanting having a better life while the rest of the world is suffering? How can we actually how can we consider that? Which is actually we're not free anymore. We're under the clutches of the neoliberal policies of the imperialists, and they are a common enemy, and that's what we need to keep focused on, and not be distracted by some of the petty arguments we've seen. Actually, just on that, I believe Luke actually asked a very good question. We'll just scroll up to it. Yes, he actually asked it to Helen, but maybe anyone else. Are there actually any works or books we can look at to learn more about Bolivarianism? If not to worry, we can look. Yeah.
I can't think of an English version of a book, but having said that, the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign is just putting out a I don't know if you can see that. We've just designed a booklet that's basically saying stop economic war against Venezuela, and we're going to be using this as a piece of material to explain what's happening in Venezuela. So it's a very short document, and it does go through history. It goes through the Constitution. It goes through the campaigns that we're running, and hopefully it would certainly give you an initial education in what's happening in Venezuela. So I will make sure that you get one, Luke.
And just one last thing too. I just want to conclude. As I said, this is the 167th anniversary of the Eureka Rebellion, and it still continues to this day. And in Australia, we've still got to travel that path. And obviously, the symbol behind me can be our symbol for anti-imperialist struggle against neoliberalism and for socialism.
Powerful. Let's see, Comrade Woolley, any concluding remarks?
Look, it's we have a world to win, and I think that's what's we have our chains to lose and a world to win, and I think that's what we're absolutely seeing. It's such an exciting time to be a person in this era, and for young people, it's so exciting for you because you are the ones that are going to be the next generation of leaders and so on. And so it's incredible. I remember when I started learning about socialism and so on, and the amount of arguments that I would get in. You don't really get into the arguments as much now. People were so opposed to socialism, and now people aren't so opposed to it that you actually have to argue about which is the better way. You now just have to explain it, and we have to explain it in a way that people understand, so that we break down the disinformation and the lies easily and quickly for people, so that they go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, no, I can understand that. Because as you said right at the start, Lily, it makes sense. It makes sense to your gut. It makes sense to your heart, and I think more and more people are coming to that conclusion as well.
Very powerful. So we're going to have our young comrade Lily take us out. Comrade, any response or any concluding remarks?
Sure. Well, there is a real alternative, anti-imperialist, anti-neoliberal movement rising around the world, whether in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, China, Iran, all over the world. There is a new bloc and a new rise of resistance to this world order of the capitalist system. And I think in the coming years, in the coming decades, we're going to see more and more a people's movement will have to be built to combat the poverty and destitution and decay that we're seeing all over the capitalist world at this moment. And I'd just like to thank you for having me on here and letting me talk.
Thank you.
All right. We went a little bit over, but we're still going to do the chant as we always do. If everyone could raise their fist and repeat after me: dare to struggle.
Dare to
struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
All power to the people.
All power
to the people.
Right on. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.